It's called Redfish by Skip Horack. The boss man called late Saturday and offered time and a half cash wages in exchange for Luther's help clearing the dock, a hand moving equipment into the warehouse while the rest of the city evacuated. Luther agreed to come in both as a favor to Quinn and because he needed the extra money for food and gas, a motel room once they got far enough north. As he expected, Shonda threw a fit. Her mama was waiting for them to pick her up in Mississippi. Still, in the end, he was able to convince her to hold off leaving until the next morning. It's like they say, money talks. He put on his blue work dickies and waited for Quinn at the edge of the projects under the streetlight at the corner of Gibson and Senate. He'd been standing there just a few minutes when a couple of teenagers stepped out of the darkness and shuffled over. The smaller of the two shuffled with the confidence of the armed and dangerous. He presented himself to Luther. "You the Redfish? Redfish Jackson?" Luther nodded slightly and stared down the empty street, still searching for Quinn's truck. "Oh, man, the Redfish!" The boy brought his hand to his mouth like he might sneeze, and he spun around to his friend. "I told you it was him!" He turned back to Luther. "How long you been out, man?" Luther looked away from the road and locked eyes with the boy. 9 months, he said. "No, stop!" The boy shook his head. "Man, I ain't seen you once." Luther shrugged. "I think maybe me and you work different hours." The boy clapped his hands. "Yeah, you're right. Quinn's pickup truck turned the corner onto Gibson and his headlights flashed 3 times. Luther stepped out onto the curb, but the boy grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "You need money? Come see me, man. I might be able to use you." Luther flicked his wrist, breaking the boy's grip. As he climbed into the cab and closed the door, Marvin Gaye crooned on the radio and Quinn grooved along. "Brother, brother, brother," as he put the truck into gear. Then Luther's boss scratched the side of his graying beard and stopped singing. "Everything straight?" "Yes." Luther turned and looked back at the boys, the young lions standing in the gold glow of the streetlight. "Damn, kids, wear me out sometimes." Quinn laughed. "Wait till you get to be my age," he said. "They be weighing you out all the time." They worked through the night, finishing up early Sunday morning when an NOPD officer, that's New Orleans Police Department, cruised across the tracks that ran alongside the Press Street Wharf. A tired officer stepped out and told them the evacuation would be declared mandatory soon enough, that both of them should be getting on the road. It was the Italian cop Quinn knew from the VFW. Luther hung back as the two men spoke, and Quinn waved a hand in the direction of the warehouse. "All due respect, I ain't going nowhere," he said. The cop frowned and glanced over at Luther. He was sizing him up, studying the prison tattoos that ran the length of his broad forearms. He spoke to Quinn, but his eyes lingered on Luther. "Then I'm supposed to tell you something," he said. "I'm supposed to tell you to write your Social Security number on your chest with a permanent marker." "That right," said Quinn. "That's meant to scare you when I say that. Make you go on and leave." Quinn grinned. "Shit, Carl. How many 60-year-old men they got running around this city with a 13-inch Johnson?" Luther snorted and the cop shook his head and smiled himself. "Just the 2 of us, I suppose." "Well, there you go," said Quinn. "A white one and a black one. That ought to be easy enough for them to sort out." The cop chuckled. "Either way, you 2 boys be careful." He opened the door to his cruiser. This looks to be the real deal. They watched the cruiser pull away and then finished clearing the dock. When they were done, Quinn locked the warehouse and drove Luther back north to the St. Bernard projects. The sun was up, and they didn't see many cars until they crossed under the interstate. People were leaving. Quinn stopped the truck back at the same spot on Gibson where he had picked Luther up earlier. Then he pulled a roll of cash from his pocket and counted out 6 20s. "That fair?" he asked. "Yeah, thanks, Chief." "All right then," said Quinn. "All right then. You know, I talked to that lawyer about you again. Says you might be owed some money for all that time you spent in Angola." "Yeah? What he says. You want to talk to him sometime?" Maybe. We'll see. You said that last time I asked." "I know. So, why don't you just tell me when you're ready? Otherwise, I won't bring it up no more." All right, thanks. I'll keep thinking on it." Later on, son. Luther stepped out of the truck. A tree grew between the road and the broken sidewalk. A big oak scarred with bullet holes. As a child, Luther would spoon lead from its trunk and lower branches. He patted the tree and began a slow stroll back to where the brick tenements began their sprawl. He was dead tired and prayed that Shonda would drive the first stretch. "Please, woman, let me get some sleep." So the Friday afternoon fights had been arranged by a little hunchback named Doyle for his wannabe mafia friends. Slick-haired 20-somethings in expensive leather coats. Luther was one of their favorites. He earned $500 for fighting, $1,000 for winning. And you fought until someone said give or was knocked out. A couple of dozen had been on hand to watch Luther take on the Mexican, an enormous day laborer Doyle had found God knows where. The man was even bigger than Luther, maybe 6'6", 300 pounds. They took off their shirts and they heard someone tell his stripper date, "Look at the scars on that Mexican, would you?" Luther glanced over at the skinny woman and she smiled at him. "You're gonna do good," she said. "I can feel it, boo." They fought off the river road on some weed-choked industrial property between the levee and the Mississippi. The spectators made a limp ring around them, and because the Mexican was bigger and stronger but older and slower, Luther spent the first few minutes of the fight just dancing, landing a jab here and there, but for the most part, staying clear. The Mexican mainly threw heavy rights and pawed like a bear with his left until he tried to close the distance between them. The Mexican had come out alone, and Luther had his Uncle Melvin with him, an old cruiserweight that knew how to patch cuts and such. "Keep them hands loose," he hollered. The Mexican squared his shoulders and let fly with a straight kick. His work boot caught Luther low in the stomach, and Luther doubled over and then tried to turn his head away because he knew that big right would be coming. And that big right did come. It caught him on the side of the head, and he felt an electric shiver run down the side of his entire body. His eyes clouded, and he dropped to a knee. Uncle Melvin screamed, "Here he come!" And Luther caught a blurred glimpse of the Mexican boots shuffling closer. He shot out a leg and took the man down. Luther was on top, but he didn't want to wrestle. So he scrambled to his feet before the Mexican could grab a solid hold of him, and they were up circling. "Watch them kicks!" Uncle Melvin yelled. The Mexican was a bulldog. Luther danced, and he still came, pushing forward with his head down, absorbing punches, and as he waited for Luther to make another mistake. They drifted with the slope of the land as they fought. And when they reached the riverbank, the cheering crowd parted, and they splashed into the water. They were ankle deep in the dirty Mississippi. Doyle ordered them to come back, but fighters weren't listening. Luther could tell that the Mexican was beginning to gasp from punching air. The tired man continued to scratch with his left, and at last Luther decided that he was going to throw this overhand right that he had been saving. He sank his foot into the soft river bottom and drove hard, swiveling his hips as he launched. The punch landed dead center, and Luther felt the Mexican's nose break. But he still didn't drop. Blood poured from his shattered nose and collected in the water. The Mexican wiped his face with a wet hand and charged. Luther turned for high ground. But the water and mud robbed him. The Mexican caught him by the waist, and they fell in a splashing heap. He had Luther dead to rights. He was on top of him in the shallow water, forcing his head under the water. Uncle Melvin was yelling, "Get off him, you MFer, before I shoot you!" When Luther finally rolled free, he missed with a punch, and the Mexican grabbed him, and they wrestled deeper and deeper into the river until the current began to pull at the both of them. The Mexican lost his footing, couldn't swim. He panicked, began to flail, and Luther made a bid for his outstretched hand, but it slipped away. The Mexican spun twice and disappeared beneath the surface. Luther went to shore, and the woman started crying. "Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God." But nothing ever came of it. Nothing. Doyle wrote down the names of everyone there that day. He said it'd be a real mistake for them to ever go talking about this. As far as Luther knew, the body was never even found, or at least not identified. It was like his uncle told him on the first of their 3 buses back to the projects. No body, no crime. Uncle Melvin shook his head. "You should have seen the blood in that water. I swear y'all look like a couple of bleeding fish." Luther told him, "Keep quiet, now and forever." There was only a short silence before his uncle laughed. "Start calling you the Redfish." And they did. Shonda had the windows down, and Luther woke up early Sunday afternoon. He could smell the salt marsh mixed with the pines that grew in a thin stretch along the berm of the highway. Her battered Dodge Diplomat skipped across the tidal streams as it crossed a series of small bridges that led to a larger one. Shonda punched his arm and told him, "That big river down there, that's the Pearl." Luther wiped a seed of sleep from his eyes and licked the scum from his teeth. He was still in his stiff work clothes, and his boots felt tight on his feet. "You really from out here?" he asked. "You know it." "Damn, girl, you country? Holla, Redfish." Luther sighed. Shonda had moved into the St. Bernard project just a few weeks back, about the same time his grandmother had finally told him that he needed to go and get a place of his own. They met at PJ's. They had one drink before they wound up in her bed. In the morning, Shonda said she'd feel a whole lot safer in St. B with a big-ass man like him around. They lived like that ever since. "Want me to drive?" he asked. Shonda shook her head and sent the white beads in her hair clicking. "No," she drawled. "You done missed all the traffic." "Sorry about that." "Yeah, I bet you real sorry. But we there now anyways." The sky was big and blue, and Luther breathed it in, ashamed to tell her that this was his first time ever out of the city as a free man. The tires hummed beneath him, and the Pearl River Bridge descended and gave way to asphalt. Another several miles and Shonda turned off the highway. Her mother lived down a gravel road set back in the pines, and Luther saw that the windows had been boarded up, raw yellow plywood spray painted with citations from Bible passages that he didn't know. Genesis 11, Psalm 23. The Dodge stopped just 10 yards from the trailer, and Luther stepped out and stretched. Shonda climbed the steps and waved him over. The door was unlocked, and he followed her inside. Luther's eyes were still adjusting to the dim trailer light when he registered a figure sitting in the corner with a shotgun. The man flicked his cigarette on the dull blue carpet. "Hoo-wee," he said. Shonda screamed, "What are you doing here?" The man was staring at Luther. He had a bottle of Wild Irish Rose pinned between his knees. "Here's this motherfucker," he said. Shonda took a small step away from Luther and, "Where's my mama, Freddie?" "I put her on a bus. Don't you worry about her." "You did what?" "I figured she'd come for her mama." Red-eyed Freddie smiled at Luther. "I know my wife." "Wife," Luther said. Freddie leveled a shotgun at Luther's crotch, then took a pull from the bottle of whiskey, licked his wet lips. "Look like maybe you know her pretty well, too." "Wife," said Luther again. "I ain't scared of no big man." As he tossed Shonda a roll of duct tape and ordered her to wrap Luther's ankles and wrists real good and tight. They left him laid out on the linoleum floor of the kitchen. Freddie dragged Shonda outside, and she called them both a couple of punk cowards and slammed the door shut. After a while, Luther heard Freddie's hidden car start up behind the trailer. He looked at the empty wallet resting next to his head on a dark piece of his heart hoped that Freddie would take that lying woman down the road and shoot her. On the kitchen table, a digital clock marked the time in fluorescent green. But then at midnight it went dark when the power failed. It was black inside the trailer now, and Luther counted out the minutes to keep the time. Near as he could figure, it was another long hour before he was finally able to work his hands free. He pulled himself across the room. He felt through the drawers and cabinets until he found a flashlight under the sink, snapped it on, and unraveled the tape binding his ankles, and saw that his wrists were rubbed raw and bleeding. Standing, he went to the sink and tried the water. Dry. The trailer pulled from a well. The pump needed electric. In the dead fridge, Luther discovered a gallon of apple juice. He hooked his fingers through the loop on the neck of the glass jug, balanced it in the crook of his arms as he drank. Just then, the narrow trailer began to rock in the wind, and the juice ran down his chin onto the floor of his work shirt and on his work shirt. Luther tried the phone, but there was no dial tone. He opened the door and made his way down the steps. Shonda's Dodge Diplomat sat crooked in the dusty hardpan. Two of his tires had been slashed across the sidewalls. The trunk was open, and he could see that the garbage bag holding his clothes were missing. "God damn," he said. A light salty mist began to fall, and the wind in the pines made a sound like a faraway applause. Luther walked back inside. He was hunting for some spare batteries when he found Shonda's mother taped up in the bedroom closet. They'd come for him the first week in 1999. He was eating breakfast with his grandmother when he heard, "Police! Search warrant!" A moment before the door was ripped off its hinges. A stun grenade bounced into the room and exploded in a flash bang of blindness and confusion. Luther dropped to the floor as the men in black washed over him. His grandmother was under the table, moaning. Tears dripped from Luther's cheeks as he tried to tell the cops where the pills were. The old woman's wig was off, and her bald head shone through like a blue-black melon. Luther took a step back, wincing from the sour smell of piss. "Damn," he said, "how long you been in there?" She looked up at him, just blinking. Luther knelt down and he brushed his fingers across the duct tape covering her mouth. "Don't be afraid," he said. I'm friends with Shonda." Luther balanced the flashlight on his shoulder and shrugged, pinning it in place against his neck. He began to peel the thick tape from the woman's ankles and wrists. Came off easily at first, the tape. But when he reached the final layers in the tender places, her tissue paper skin threatened to tear. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. So sorry." Once her hands were free, he stepped aside and let the woman pull the tape from her face at whatever pace she could handle. She worked quicker than he would have, and as the last of it came off, Luther saw that her mouth was wide open, like Freddie had silenced her in the act of screaming. "You okay?" he said. The woman spit a thread of green phlegm into the hem of her filthy nightgown. "What do you think?" Luther held out his hand, but she pushed it away and rose with no help from him. It was not until he passed her the flashlight, put her in control, that he was able to convince her that he meant her no harm. He told her about Freddie running off with Shonda, and all she did was shake her head. "Serves them both right," she said in a high, quick voice. "Them two deserve each other." I guess. You got a name?" "Luther." She gave a sharp nod. "I'm Betty." The woman retreated into the bathroom with the flashlight, and Luther listened in the dark, and she tried the shower and cursed. When she came back out, she was naked. Luther turned and said, Whoa now, Miss Betty." Betty ignored him and pushed past with a towel slung over her bony shoulder. Luther heard the front door open. He hurried after her. The rain was falling steady now. He stood on the concrete steps, searching. She had the flashlight lying beside the door, and Luther took it in his hands, playing the beam through the pines until he found her. She stood naked in the clearing. Head thrust back, arms stretched out, rain ran down in sheets down her small, wrinkled body. Luther could see that she was smiling, maybe even laughing. You all right?" he hollered. Betty shook her head quickly from side to side but said nothing. "Come on now. You're going to get hurt out there." After he'd arrived in Angola, Luther began spending whatever free time he was allowed in the prison library. He found solace among those books, a place where he could escape the attention a giant receives in the yard. With nothing else to do, he studied law. He learned how to challenge his murder sentence with motions and writs that he wrote out by hand and filed with the Court of Appeals. For a time, the library meant hope. But that hope began to fade as one by one his pleadings were denied. After 4 years, he was all out of legal theories. It was at the onset of this dark period that Luther was called into the warden's office. His attorney from the trial was sitting there, the same fat man who had tried to hug him when the verdict was read. The warden shook Luther's hand and told him that he'd be free to go within the week. "Congratulations, another big black man has confessed to your crimes." A Times-Picayune reporter had tracked him down after he was back living in the city with his grandmother. She asked Luther how it felt to be a free man. After he stared at her until she blushed, she admitted that it was a stupid question. But her next one was no better. "Mr. Jackson, what was it like to be an innocent man in prison?" Luther ended the interview. He wasn't innocent. He felt like telling her. He just hadn't killed that man. Betty sat down across from him in the living room and shined the flashlight right into his eyes. She had dried herself off and put on a clean pink housecoat, big fuzzy slippers. This was an interrogation. "What are you doing running around with a married man? What are you doing running around with a married woman?" she asked. All his practice lying, an entire lifetime it seemed, and Luther didn't know how to answer the woman without putting the poor woman's daughter in a bad light. Finally, he stopped trying. He told the story straight but simple. "I didn't ask for none of this," he added. Betty appeared to soften. "You hungry?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Stay there then. I'll be right back." Betty went into the kitchen and returned carrying a cardboard box. Inside were a can of sterno, a book of matches, a small pot, 2 bowls, and 2 spoons. For food, she had small cans of Campbell's soup, all different flavors. That and a jug of water she had stashed somewhere. Luther hadn't eaten since the night before, when Quinn gave him half of his cheese and po' boy sandwich. He eyed the soup and Betty caught him staring. "So take your pick." "You sure?" "We'll share," she said. "Now choose." He settled on vegetable beef and Betty passed him the can to open. She wriggled her fragile fingers. "Those flip tops," she said, "murder on my old hands." Luther pried open the lid and poured the soup into the pot. Betty cut it with splashes of fresh water and then stirred the mixture with a few dainty stabs of her spoon. Luther lit one of the sternos and Betty killed the flashlight. They talked while Luther balanced the pot over the flame. He told her that last he heard, the hurricane was still a Category 5 and would be making landfall sometime after sunrise. Betty nodded and said, "Then we should get some sleep before morning. Big day tomorrow." There was a flatness to her voice that Luther recognized from the project's prison. The sterno's flickering seance light illuminated her polished face, and he was frightened by her expression. He thought he saw something of that dead-eyed fatalism that had been following him around his whole damn life. Luther didn't sleep. He couldn't ever, not really. Instead, he lay all night on the couch listening to the angry wind and Betty's peaceful snores echoing from the back bedroom. She had lent him an old silver watch that belonged to her dead husband. It told that it would be daylight soon, and sure enough, it wasn't long before the sun penetrated the thin gaps between the plywood boards covering the windows. Gray light filled the trailer, and Luther sat up and put on his boots. Water was flowing beneath him. He could hear it. He walked across the living room and opened the door. Oh, man! The Pearl River had overflowed its banks and flooded the woods surrounding the trailer. The pines blew like wheat in the wind. The clearing was a white-capped sea. The water lapped at the front steps, and Luther realized that it was still rising. He watched as a gust of wind sent a wave surging through the pine forest. Water slapped against the top step of the trailer and soaked his feet. He saw that Shonda's Dodge had been swept off in the night. Luther heard Betty cough behind him. "Well, what are you looking at?" "Water," said, "a whole lot of water." Betty sidled up next to him to take a look. She said, "We need to get on the roof." "I'm not getting on any roof, Luther." "We can't wait much longer. We're liable to get trapped in here." "Maybe." Luther shook his head and looked out the door. The water was skimming into the trailer now. There was a splashing off to the left, and he saw a pair of jet black feral hogs swimming hard, fighting their way to the high ground of the highway. Betty pointed. "Pigs! Close the door!" "We closed this door and there won't be no opening again. Luther took her by the wrist. We gotta go. I done told you, I'm staying. We'll see. The wind picked up even more and started snapping pines. A heavy branch crashed nearby and Luther flinched. Betty tried to close the door herself, but he stopped her. You gonna make a tomb out of this trailer. Betty pinched him on his arm and returned to the sofa. The water was past their ankles, and she kicked off her wet slipper. All my things are getting ruined. Luther admitted that they were. Still, ain't nothing here can't be replaced except me and you. Betty took up the family Bible resting on the warped coffee table. That's not true at all, not one damn bit. It was at that moment Luther decided he would leave her. Figured he'd be lucky just to make it through the storm on his own. Stay here then. I'm gonna go check things out. Betty pulled her bare feet up onto the sofa and refused to look at it. Suit yourself, she said. But you leave that watch right here with me. Luther inched his way out of the trailer and down the sunken steps. The water ran past his waist and the rain stung his face. He turned to put the worst part of the weather at his back and shuffle along with the current. In the distance, he could see Shonda's lost car. The Dodge was wedged between two pines holding steady against the current. A popping sound, and he turned. The roof on the trailer started to buckle from the wind. An entire corner was peeled back like a lid from one of Betty's cans of soup. Luther stood frozen. The hurricane punched him. He was halfway between the trailer and Shonda's car. The car. It had to be the car. So he went for it. His boots were like bricks on his feet, but he dog paddled his way through the pines. He was exhausted when he reached the trapped Dodge. The hood was slippery and he cut his hands trying to pull himself out of the water. He leaned back against the windshield and watched the rain blow sideways through the trees. A rabbit swam by and he thought about Betty, dead or dying. He could have brought her with him, forced her along. Luther wondered what that meant for his soul. Not trying to save somebody that didn't want saving. He saw his blood mixing with the flood water, and he was reminded of that mythic fight that made his name. Truth be told, he always took more than a little pride in being called the Redfish, coming out of that bloody water alive. Hell, he admitted it. He was the Redfish. And that might just be what kept him alive all these years. Thank you.